Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to Chapter 17 of your Psych 121 course. We are now looking at the thing that probably everybody, when they sign up for a psych course, is actually interested in talking about, and you've had to put up with all of these other facets prior to getting to the thing that you're actually wanting to learn about. So we're going to be talking about defining psychological disorders over the next little bit. So by way of beginning, I'd like to read the U of S land acknowledgement. So as we engage in remote teaching and learning, I'd like to acknowledge that the Saskatoon campus of the University of Saskatchewan is on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. I'd also like to recognize that some may be attending this course from other traditional Indigenous lands. I ask that you take a moment to make your own land acknowledgement to the peoples of those lands. In doing so, we're actively participating in reconciliation as we navigate our time in this course, learning and supporting each other. The big question in psychology, and probably for most of us, is what actually makes a behavior abnormal? Well, part of this is then considering the role of what is a psychological disorder? How do we know if something is actually out of the norm? How do we tell what a mental disorder is? How do we describe that to someone? What would be our criteria for determining what is disordered versus normal? Well, as psychologists, there are many different systems and formulations for how to come up with a diagnosis or how to determine if something is perhaps normal or if it's maybe a little bit kind of on the outside or if there's some maybe other factors. And so what I'm going to do is I'll present a few criteria, some things to consider when thinking about whether or not a behavior is in fact disordered versus so-called normal. And so there's one formulation called the 4Ds. And so one of the questions we ask is the behavior deviant? Is it deviant from the norm? Well, if a behavior is deviant, that doesn't necessarily mean, though, that it's a mental disorder. There are many behaviors that are deviant and that are not by any means disordered. Well, maybe we can ask, is the behavior in and of itself dysfunctional? Does it have a negative impact on the individual? Um, is the behavior distressing? Is it distressing to the individual and or to other people that may be around the person? Is the behavior dangerous? Is it dangerous to either the individual or to others? Now, in any of these categories, we could say, yes, it's possible for it to be either dysfunctional, distressing, and dangerous, and yet still not be a disorder. So we need some more questions then to ask ourselves whether or not a behavior is in fact disordered. So this is a helpful starting point, but maybe we need to ask some other questions. One of the important questions always to ask when determining what a behavior is, whether it's abnormal or normal, is the behavior context specific or is it global? Is it happening in only one situation or is it happening all the time? How long does the behavior last? That's another important question to ask. How often does it occur? How intense is it? Right? All of these things help us then to kind of determine whether or not this is falling then in the realm of a mental disorder. But probably the most important question that we need to ask is whether or not the behavior is leading to impairment. Does the behavior lead to a functional impairment for the individual? And not only that, what contexts would we see that impairment in? So are we seeing it only at home, only at school, only at work? Are we seeing it across all of these contexts or in 2 out of 3? That's a very important consideration for us when we're determining whether or not a behavior in and of itself is now worthy of being considered a disorder. So what I'm really talking about here is the branch of abnormal psychology. And abnormal psychology is the application of psychological science to understanding and treating mental disorders. At least 500 million people are affected worldwide by some type of mental disorder. The impact of mental illness is particularly strong on people who are poorer, of lower socioeconomic class, and from disadvantaged ethnic groups. So when we kind of take a look at it, we also have to recognize that mental disorders are highly prevalent. So prevalence refers to the frequency or occurrence of a given condition in a population at a given time. So when we look, for example, at the prevalence rates for psychological disorders in Canada, the lifetime prevalence is 33.1% for any kind of mental or substance use disorder. That is pretty darn high. If we look at the mood disorders, the lifetime prevalence is about 12.6% of the population, and the 12-month prevalence over the past 12 months, about 5.4% of Canadians have suffered with some kind of mood disorder. So prevalence is important to consider. So 33% of all people in Canada at some point in their life will struggle with a mental health or a substance use disorder. It is important for us to consider, how do we intervene in a meaningful way? Now, back to the original question of defining disorder. Here's one definition. A psychological disorder is any kind of ongoing dysfunctional pattern of thought, emotion, and behavior that causes significant distress and that's considered deviant in that person's culture or society. Now, psychological disorders share similarities with other medical disorders. Firstly, they're out of the patient's control. Secondly, they may be treated by drugs, which is often covered by medical insurance. Three, they all have both biological as well as environmental influences. Now, I want to actually just go back to the may be treated by drugs thing. Yes, there are many psychological disorders that could be treated by drugs, but also the question that we should consider and that we will consider, particularly in the Chapter 18 videos, is should they be treated by drugs, or are there other things that are perhaps better or more helpful? Now, one of the big things that psychology has worked very, very hard to do over the last, especially the last kind of couple decades, is helping to validate the discipline, particularly by looking at a lot of things through a medical lens. And one of the things is that we can actually look at mental disorders through what we call the biopsychosocial model. And what that means is that we assume then that disorders are caused by biological, psychological, and social factors. So, biological, we're talking about influences from the body, so whether that's genetics or some kind of biological cue or disorder or dysfunction that leads to disorder. There are psychological influences, so things within the person, such as patterns of negative thinking and stress responses. And there's also a social component, so social and cultural influences that lead to a particular outcome. So here we go. So looking at a psychological disorder, then, in the biopsychosocial model, we see disorder as being triggered by any one of these three areas, or sometimes all of these three areas, and that the confluence of events therefore leads to a disorder. Now, having said that there are similarities between psychological and medical disorders, there are also important differences. Firstly, the diagnosis of psychological disorders can be much more difficult as there's no corresponding test for a psychological disorder. A large degree of the diagnosis for a particular psychological disorder comes down to clinical judgment. Now, while we are busy building tests and coming up with new ways of doing things, one of the biggest challenges facing psychology and psychiatry is that there's no clear biological indicators for most tests. So, for example, the brains of people with severe mental disturbances often look identical to those of people without such disturbances. Now, obviously, there are some noticeable differences here and there, particularly if the cause of disorder is something like a traumatic brain injury. But overall, there is no biological test that we can do to say, yep, that's the mental disorder that you got there. So, psychological disorders are instead diagnosed based on clinical observations, detailed note taking, and detailed case history evaluation, as well as there are some rating scales and some tools that we can use. But overall, it's very much an observation based diagnosis. Now, whether a given behavior is considered a disorder is determined both by whether the behavior is unusual and also whether it's maladaptive. So that's that whole idea again of impairment. We want to understand the extent to which it causes distress and dysfunction to the individual. So, like I said before, there can be behaviors that are unusual and not maladaptive. So, for example, if you're, giving 30% of your monthly income to a religious organization you believe in, while that might be unusual, it may not be maladaptive if you are still able to live off of the 70%. We also know that there are behaviors that are maladaptive and also not unusual. So, for example, consuming alcohol. Again, thinking back to that prevalence chart, about 22% of all Canadians are going to have a lifetime prevalence of suffering from a substance use or meeting the criteria for substance use disorder. That's a high amount. So we do have a lot of maladaptive but not unusual behavior within our context. So that's why looking at the 4Ds, the context, duration, etc., is so important when we're trying to decide whether or not something is a psychological disorder. And one of the things that often happens with psychological disorders is that they don't come in ones. They come in twos or mores. And that is what we call comorbidity. Oh my goodness. Comorbidity is the reality that psychological disorders frequently occur together. And that is when people suffer from one disorder, but they also suffer from another one at the same time. Now, since many disorders are comorbid, most severe mental disorders are concentrated in a small group of people, so about 6% of the population, who have more than three of them. Now, unfortunately, with mental disorders, people face an incredible amount of stigma. People stigmatize people with psychological disorders. When we talk about stigma, we're talking about a kind of a disgrace or a defect that indicates a person belongs to a culturally devalued social group. People with mental disorders and people with psychological disorders are often stigmatized. The stigma of mental health disorders affects people while they're ill, while they're healing, even after they've healed. Just think, for example, of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is probably one of the most feared psychological disorders out there, and yet, if people are able to receive the treatment and help that they have, they can live very productive, helpful, meaningful lives. And yet, that stigma of having schizophrenia follows a person, which often keeps them unable then to live healthy, productive, valuable lives. The most significant problem of stigmatization is that it slows down recovery. I mean, I would agree that it is one of the problems of it, but also I think there are many other problems with it. Now, if we know that people are going to be stigmatized for seeking help or getting help, it also reduces the likelihood of people seeking treatment. It reduces self-esteem and it increases isolation and hopelessness. And unfortunately, increasing hopelessness is not particularly helpful when we're trying to help motivate people that things can get better for them. So it's up to all of us who are informed about the causes of psychological disorders to understand that mental illness is not a fault and people don't choose to have mental illness. It is a complex confluence of factors that lead to psychological disorders. And it's important for all of us to play our part in helping to overcome stigma through education, community action, and individual support for people. So, how do psychologists, psychiatrists, the folks who kind of work within this realm, how do we classify mental disorders? Well, this is how we do it. We do it using the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, or what we call the shorthand is the DSM-5. The DSM-5 has been called the so-called Bible of mental disorders. And what it does is it uses categories of symptoms and patients whose symptoms are similar to the description of the category. Um, and if you have that, then you're said to have that disorder. Okay, so there's these kind of not really checklists, but lists of symptoms that are expected to have. And then, you'll go through it and you'll kind of count the number of symptoms a person has. And if they kind of meet the threshold, then yep, they're in. And if not, nope, then they're out. The DSM frequently uses qualifiers to indicate different levels of severity within a category or different types of presentations for how a mental disorder may look. So, for example, for ADHD, we might classify it as having mild, moderate, or severe severity. And the same with autism as well as other ones. Now, each revision considers new knowledge and cultural norms and factors that information into the diagnostic process. Now, the DSM-5, the most recent revision for it was 2013. It contains somewhere between 159 to 297 diagnoses, and it really depends on who's counting. And if you'd like to take a look, there is someone who's done a lot of counting on that. You can click that link and go check out James Morrison's work on this. It was first published in 1952, and at that time it had a whopping 22 diagnoses. Most of them were mainly psychotic disorders that had a strong biological basis. So the big question comes then, why the huge difference? How do we jump from 22 all the way to somewhere between 155 to 297? Well, Alan Francis, who is the chair of the DSM-4 task force, put out a very powerful video, really kind of his own mea culpa of his role in expanding the diagnostic machinery. But the reality comes down to a couple of things. One is that, first of all, we know a lot more about mental disorders now than what they did in 1952. So, I mean, that's kind of your first kind of go-to. Secondly, too, though, there has been a bit of a shift that, and Alan Francis's big kind of thrust is, are we beginning to pathologize normal life? And that's an important question. Now, for something again to be a mental disorder, it should be again meeting the criteria of impairment. So while we might say like, yeah, maybe we're diagnosing more things now than we did before, sometimes it's due to the fact that we know more. We know that some things that we thought were in these larger categories are actually better served in smaller subcategories, and it's also part of the fact that that we do see a lot more behavior that's leading to impairment, hence the response of creating more diagnostic categories. Now, with any diagnostic system, there are always problems. And so you can't get away from it. So whether you're looking at the DSM or the ICD or some other kind of diagnostic system, all of them have their own problems. Now, I'm going to give you a few just because that's part of my job, but also just as a way of kind of helping you to think through some of the process of some of these things. So for example, the danger of diagnosis, of overdiagnosis, okay? So with having multiple diagnoses, there is also a danger with overdiagnosis. Now, ADHD in the last 20 years has become an incredibly popular diagnosis. It is particularly popular for young boys who have a difficult time sitting still in school. Now, why am I saying young boys? Well, it's because young boys are predominantly the ones who are being diagnosed with ADHD. Now, one of the big problems is that this diagnosis is quite unstable, especially when a child is young. What do I mean by that? Well, oftentimes at a young age, children tend to present with more hyperactivity and impulsivity, right? Well, that is one of the subtypes of ADHD, ADHD hyperactive impulsive. Well, we know though, if it's ADHD, that will likely shift. And as a child becomes older, hyperactive impulsive symptoms will decrease, whereas inattentive symptoms tend to increase. We also know that, in some cases, young kids who might meet the criteria when they're very young may not meet it when they're very old. Now, one of the other problems to consider is that the DSM was written for adults. So most of the diagnoses that are being applied to kids have basically just been scaled down based on the adult criteria, scaled down towards children. Well, that's not always a very helpful thing. Now, here's another little fact that I want you just to consider. Children whose birth date is near the school admissions cutoff are significantly more likely to get diagnosed with ADHD than children whose birth dates are further away. In other words, if your birthday is in October, November, or December, you are more likely to receive an ADHD diagnosis than if your birthday is is earlier on in the school year. So are we diagnosing ADHD or are we diagnosing immaturity based on the age of the child? So, if you're a clinician one day, really take that to heart and consider that. Are you diagnosing actual symptoms in that child, or are you just comparing them based to the other children within that grade who may just be a little bit more mature because they're just a little bit older? Just a thought. Now, the other thing to consider is with any diagnostic system is that diagnostic labels convey, I mean, they're powerful. And they're powerful in a sense that when somebody says to you, here, you are sick with this, it can have a significant impact on your life. It can have a positive impact. Sometimes people are very relieved. Thank you. Now I finally know what's wrong with me. On the other hand, it can also have a very negative impact on someone's life. For many people, it allows them or leads them to adopt a sick role. Well, I've got this thing, so I can never do this or I can never do that. Well, that's not particularly helpful. In other cases, what it does is it causes someone to justify their behaviors. Well, I'm always late and I'm always disorganized. It's just my ADHD. Well, no, you're probably just quite disorganized. Yeah, your ADHD probably contributes to that, but in and of itself, it's not your ADHD's fault, right? So these kind of factors are important for us to consider. Again, the other question is this a serious mental disorder or is this just a normal problem? So for example, one of the areas that I often see a lot of questions about are things surrounding oppositional defiant disorder and compliance. And one of the questions is sometimes is this just a child who's just more non-compliant, or is there some parent-child relational problems that are actually causing or maintaining this pattern of behavior? So these are some of the important questions that we need to consider. In addition to this, and this is a very important thing for you to note, um, a diagnostic system in and of itself conveys this illusion of objectivity and universality. Well, let me just give you a couple examples for when these large systems have failed. Now, back in the 1700s and 1800s, there was a mental disorder called drapetomania. All right, and this particular mental disorder was when we would diagnose someone with this, and was only used for slaves of cotton plantation owners, or owners who had slaves, and this was considered a mental disorder. Whenever a slave would run away from his master, this was considered a mental disorder. All right. Now, looking back at this from the 21st century, we're probably horrified that we would even consider that a mental disorder, because of obviously the important social, cultural context that would lead a slave to want to flee from their master, their so-called master, right? But at that point in time, that was considered mental illness. Here's another time. 1973, overnight, 1 million Americans became non-disordered when the DSM committee met and decided that homosexuality was no longer a mental disorder. Okay, so overnight, 1 million people moved from having a mental disorder to not having a mental disorder because a bunch of old white guys got together and decided, well, it's no longer a mental disorder. All right, so you have to understand that with every diagnostic system, there are these problems. Okay, now, is this me saying don't trust the DSM, don't trust diagnosis? No, this is me saying, though, we have to think about these things critically. We have to think about the implications of the tools that we're using. We have to recognize that there's no such thing as a perfect tool. And so we have to always weigh out these factors and think to ourselves, am I seeing something here objectively that is mental disorder, or am I framing it through some other lens which may would lead me to a different conclusion? So, where does this leave us? Well, most psychologists, most mental health professionals have a love-hate relationship with this diagnostic system because it's not perfect, right? We're trying to place people with dimensional problems into a category, all right? And even though we're trying to move away from this categorical thing to a more dimensional approach, that is a growing pain and it is a challenging thing to do. Um, as I said, there are other classification systems, but the DSM is currently the norm in North America. One of the things, though, that it has to its benefit is that for mental health professionals, the DSM creates a common language for talking about mental disorders. We are then talking about the same thing. So it's important for us to have it for that purpose. It helps clients and others to be able to put a name to the thing that concerns them. It helps researchers guide both assessment and treatment protocols, and this in turn improves the quality of services. So we do, even though we might hate it and we know it's not perfect, we still actually do need it because it helps us to be able to do better and to improve. Now, some of the things about the DSM that are kind of cool is that the disorders are organized in each chapter as well as overall in a developmental sequence. So in the order that they'd be most likely to arise and or be detected. So for example, autism before dementia. But also, for whatever reason, dissociative disorders appear before enuresis and encopresis, which are things that we would actually expect for young children to experience, not a dissociative disorder. So again, some kind of mess ups there, but alas, we'll get over it. Some of the other cool features is that it does come with a series of cross-cutting symptom checklists. So what the DSM authors are recognizing is that many disorders share common symptoms, which makes it hard to distinguish meaningfully between them. So it's moving away from kind of a categorical approach towards more of a dimensional approach. So instead of these discrete categories, we've got spectra now. So, for example, we've got autism spectrum disorder as opposed to having Asperger's and autistic disorder / pervasive developmental disorder. So just to kind of give you just like a brief little picture of what this looks like, back in the day, you'd have autistic, disorder. You'd have PDD-NOS, which was pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. You would have Asperger's syndrome, and you would just kind of have this kind of mix, for things of what would be kind of autism, PDD-NOS, AS. Well, now these things are collapsed, so there's no longer Asperger's syndrome, there's no longer PDD-NOS, and autism, instead of it being a discrete category, is now a spectrum. So we recognize, for example, that someone with autism can have anywhere from profound, what used to be called mental retardation, what we would now call profound intellectual disabilities, all the way up to having kind of a genius IQ. We also know, for example, that the level of impairment or atypicality in behavior can be anywhere from very, very mild and quite highly functional to very, very severe. So all of these factors kind of help us to, so when we move to this spectrum approach, it helps us to kind of collapse some of these discrete categories into broader spectra. Now, doing that creates its own set of problems, but we're not going to talk about that today. And the DSM has several kind of groups of disorders here, so I've listed the ones that are in the DSM for you, just so you kind of have an idea of the larger categories. There are some kind of large stuff, and for the purpose of this class, that we're going to focus on some anxiety disorders, not even all of them, which will also include OCD, which technically is now in its own section of the DSM, but really is an anxiety-based disorder. We'll talk a little bit about dissociative disorders, mood disorders. So when I'm saying mood disorders, I'm talking about depression and bipolar. We'll talk about schizophrenia spectrum and some psychotic disorders, and finally a little bit about personality disorders. But before doing that, I'm going to end this video and we'll pick up where we left off in a moment.